Good day, my name is Juanita Steenekamp. I'm a project director here at SAICA. I'd like to welcome you to our follow-up discussion with Advocate Neville Melville from the Office of the Consumer Goods and Services Ombud. We will specifically be talking about the registration requirements and how it will affect the public. Thanks. Thanks, Neville. Neville, in our last discussion, we spoke about the work of the Ombud and the office, but your funding model depends on people or entities registering with the Ombud. It's mandatory for all eligible businesses to comply with the provisions of the code and to register.
Yes.
And then, of course, to pay certain monies over, which will then form part of your budget.
Right.
So let's start with the suppliers that need to register. Who are you targeting and who should be registering with the Ombud?
All right, so first of all, they must fall within the broadly defined consumer goods and services industry. So that excludes the motor industry, and shortly will exclude the funeral industry if their code is passed and so forth. So it's really the sort of goods and services that one would traditionally associate with the consumer environment, where a person has a service performed either at their home or in the office or something like that, or for something that they use personally, or also something that they purchase for their personal use. But in addition to that, one has to look at the actual size of the entity that's involved, that one deals with, from the point of view, do the goods and services ultimately reach a consumer? If they do, it doesn't matter whether or not the business actually deals directly with those smaller entities or with private individuals. So even if it's fairly high up in the supply chain, if it in any way contributes either directly or indirectly to the provision of those goods and services at the end of the day, then it too would be brought into the net, and that might include logistics, packaging, and all sorts of things like that. And certainly the producers of the products and goods, ultimately it's also a question that we're grappling with as to whether it would always include raw materials. And I think we've taken the view that unless the raw materials are in some way directly evident in the final product, then it's probably not intended to go that far back up the line.
Okay.
Although, for instance, if one's talking about chicken, which might be a raw material in a pie, then it becomes quite important. For instance, if someone, as we did have in our office, has a problem with the pie and breaks the tooth on a stone, then we have to decide, was the stone in the pastry, was it in the chicken, was it in the peas, and so forth. So it's important that we know exactly everyone that's involved in that particular supply chain. And I think it's also relevant for businesses to know that we can deal with the dispute going up the supply chain and decide who should actually be responsible. So was it the person that manufactured the cell phone, was it the person who distributed it, or was it the shop that actually sold it? And so then it becomes important that they are all involved in that whole process and that we have access to all of them.
Okay, so you would expect all of them to be registered individually?
Yes, very much so.
Okay. Even like engineering, would you also see that industry to be registered?
No, I think that's a bit remote. I don't think it's the intention to spread the net too far, and particularly if the entity falls within a different regulatory environment, either in terms of statute or if another ombudsman's been created, then there'd be no intention to have an overlapping jurisdiction, although sometimes the jurisdiction can be fairly closely associated. For instance, if someone buys furniture on credit and they have a problem with the furniture, it could have an impact on the credit, and they may end up having to approach, or at least having two ombudsmen involved with different aspects of the complaint.
So you'd have the national credit regulator and then yourself.
Well, the credit regulator or the credit ombudsman, depending on what sort of complaint it was.
Okay. There's no specific exemptions that you're aware of?
Yes, there is provision for anything that's not a service relating to the communication services. So, for instance, the cell phone networks, etc. And motor vehicles are specifically excluded. And as I was saying now, anyone who falls under a different regulatory environment would also be excluded.
Okay. If I look at a supplier on a lower level which has a mix of customers,
right,
They would have individuals,
Yes.
which is the Act applies to them, and also juristic persons. And now the Act applies to juristic persons with a turnover below 2 million, but not to the ones above. So then only those customers could actually approach you to settle
Well,
their...
from the point of view of the customers, but from the point of view of the supplier,
Yes.
they would also be liable for goods and services that they provided to juristic persons who were above the threshold if those goods and services ultimately landed up with consumers. So we would also need to take that into consideration. And it does make for some messy calculations at the end of the day to decide which goods and services never reach the consumer and are not part of the process. For instance, letting out property, etc., to businesses may be something that a group is involved in, as well as providing consumer goods and services.
Sure. So you following like a look-through approach, basically,
Yes,
in terms of that.
So we would look at each case on its merits, and we have got provision for people to actually motivate to us why either they shouldn't fall within our jurisdiction at all, or if they do, that they can ring-fence particular aspects of their business, particularly if they go much broader than our remit.
Okay, because that brings me to my next question in terms of the fee. Now, the registration fee that suppliers have to pay over to you is based on their turnover.
Yes.
And again, it seems to me a bit unfair that I'm a supplier who supplies small consumers and large consumers, but my registration fee is based on my full turnover figure.
Yeah, that's why we say we would look at, if you made out a case that certain of your turnover didn't relate to goods and services that ultimately went to the consumer, then certainly we could do that. But at the end of the day, we have to accept that it is a fairly blunt measure, and the idea is that, and I know the bigger entities are not entirely happy with that, but the model that was set about to make sure it was efficient is that certainly to start off, the bigger entities would carry the lion's share of the costs, and in fact the very small entities, those with the turnover of under R1 million, don't pay anything at all.
Okay, yeah, because there is a sliding scale
Yes,
for the registration. I've looked at the entities that have registered, and I think you mentioned earlier about 240, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. But I've not picked up many names of service providers. It seems to me a lot of people that provide food, furniture, clothing. In terms of service providers, and I think that's one of the questions that my members will also ask is, do we as accountants have to register if we are providing services?
I sincerely hope not. Yeah, I don't think that's something that we've actually thought through, and it's never arisen up until this point. But what I would have to do is actually go back to the DTI and government and ask them what was their intention in setting up this code. But my own feeling is, and by no means prescriptive at this point, and I haven't thought it through, is that I don't think it was the intention to cast the net so wide that it would include professional persons who are subject to different controls and so forth. And certainly we wouldn't have the capacity, well, we may have to a limited extent, but to review the activities that an accountant or an auditor would be involved in.
Yeah. So I think from an audit side, they do have another regulator, they do have the IRBA, but accountants and many of the accountancy bodies are all voluntary bodies. Right. But we will discuss that further and engage.
Sure. I think the problem with legislation is you can't think of everything going into it, and then you have to try and work out a solution to deal with the exceptions.
Okay. In terms of other service providers, is there, and one of the other issues that I've picked up is also health and beauty. I don't see many of those industries registering. Do you foresee that they also providing services?
They should do, yes, and until such times as they get their own code, which I don't think is likely. We certainly get a lot of complaints in that area. Weddings, all sorts of things like that, and wedding photographers, that's quite a hot spot.
Okay.
When the person doesn't get their photos after paying a fortune. Sure. Yes, so virtually anything you can imagine, and until now, also funeral-related services were quite a difficult one for us.
Okay. So in terms of the codes, a certain industry can get together, like you're saying, the funerals, or if need be accountants, and have their own code, which then needs to be accredited by the minister, and then actually set up their own ombud. Is that the process?
Yes, but I think they need to look into the viability from an economic point of view, because it's quite an expensive enterprise, and I just wonder when I see smaller groupings actually talking about putting together an ombudsman, and I sort of wonder, why would you want to do that? Because a lot involved in it.
Yes, I know that's a big thing. In terms of the state, I mean, government is also not excluded from the Act in terms of a service provider. They do provide certain services. Do you foresee that they actually fit in some way?
No, certainly we don't deal with complaints, and that's one of the specific exemptions or exclusions. We don't deal with anything relating to services provided by a government entity of any description. And those were the sort of things that you would either, if it was a municipality, some of them have ombudsman, and also the public protector deals with the broad problems within the government, and I should imagine that would also include Consumer Protection Act related matters. Yeah.
Yeah, if I remember correctly, when the Act initially came to being, a lot of people said, well, now we've got some stick to actually address municipalities that were poor performers. Yeah. Neville, is there any other information that you would like to share, or you'd maybe like to tell us about before we conclude?
Well, I would certainly encourage any business owner to have a look at our website and make sure in their own mind that they didn't have to join up with us, because it's going to be very difficult for us to go and track down everyone, and expensive also to the existing suppliers. But I think it's very important also to get them on board so that they carry their share, and that will enable us to bring down the costs, which are pretty expensive at present. Even the bigger entities are finding it in this tough economy, one expense too many, and certainly I think it would be very attractive to them if we were able to spread the net and get more people on board to help pay towards it and make it more viable for everyone.
Neville, sorry, before we finish, I just actually want to ask you one last question.
Sure.
In terms of the registration and the turnover, do I register every year, or is it a once-off?
Well, it's a once-off registration, but we certainly hope that you pay us every year, because our costs are ongoing.
Okay, so you do pay the same fee again?
Well, there may be an adjustment. There hasn't been so far, but obviously we work according to a budget, and our board determines what the fee would be.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thanks for your willingness to contribute. I hope this has been of value to you and SAICA members. Thank you.